Hello to those joining us online. A warm welcome from the Goethe Institute in Amsterdam. I have no idea where I'm supposed to look. I hope you can hear me well. Today you're participating in a hybrid event in the series Vorzeichen, which will be later introduced. For those in the Bibliothek of the Goethe Institute in Amsterdam, if you don't want to appear in the images, please remain seated. After the conversation between our guests, we'll have a moment for questions. For those online, feel free to write your questions or thoughts in the Q&A window, and I'll do my best to address them after the conversation. Note that this event will be recorded, so for those in the room, if you prefer not your voice to be recorded, ask a neighbor to ask your question or forward it to me. Before we start, I want to thank Mareike Wittler from the Goethe Institute Copenhagen, Christiane Lahusen from the Goethe Institute Stockholm, Gosha Kabay from the Goethe Institute London, Sibylle Deselaars from the Goethe Institute Amsterdam, and all my other colleagues involved in this project. Today, this event is co-funded by the project Intention and Intervention from the Dutch Research Council, conducted by Dr. Leila Essa, we talked about that earlier, at the University of Utrecht, who's also present here tonight. Thank you, Leila. And now I pass the word to Maha El Hissy, the curator of the series Vorzeichen. If you have participated in previous events, you may already be familiar with her. She will introduce our guests for the evening. Thank you and a warm welcome also to all the guests.
Once again, hello and welcome everyone. It's such a pleasure and a joy to have you all here. My name is Maha. I am the curator of the event series Vorzeichen. This event series was initiated by Goethe Institutes in Northwest Europe as a canon critique. There were surveys and questionnaires that were led in different countries, basically asking academic institutions, publishing houses, translators and other actors in the literary business about what is being read from the German literary canon, or if the German literary canon is being read, what texts are being circulated. And after that, there was an opening for a curation, and it is such a joy and a pleasure to have received this chance to curate this event series. Today's event is part of a speaker series, in a total number of 6 events that take place all over the year. Today's the 3rd one. And just to briefly mention a few words about the concept of this series. When I started curating the events, I conceptualized things in a way that puts a focus on reading as a practice or a means of dismantling power structures. That was the idea, to basically ask, how do we read? And not just a question of like what and who do we get to read, but perhaps to question more what are the reading practices and how can you read things against the margin or against the grain, or like from marginalized voices and so on and so forth. One of the questions that were tackled in that sense was the question, for whom was this text not written? If we keep the question in mind, and perhaps today's event is going to take this further and ask, for whom was this text not translated, which probably will come up one way or the other in the discussion. One of the forms and means how the concept describes dismantling power structures might work as a comparative approach towards things, like to collective and comparative reading. And this is one of the reasons why I'm particularly pleased that the speakers' events are always in cooperation with a co-host, because I thought this is the ideal way to have different perspectives or different voices, different eyes shedding light on the same text, on the same context, on the topic, on the same authors, and so on and so forth. And this is just to say that I am very, very pleased to have that you, Leila Essa, agreed and accepted the invitation to co-host this event with me. Leila Essa is assistant professor for comparative literature at the University of Utrecht, and she's also this is where she leads a research project funded by the Dutch Research Council. It is on authorial strategies against exclusionary practices, particularly in Germany and in Britain. And Leila's research has inspired me a lot to think about comparative, like to take new approaches towards comparisons. And actually, now with the Dutch context, there is even one more way to open a scope of focus and to approach things and tackle things in even a more comparative way. Leila has also curated an event disrupting literature, and this event could be maybe read as a follow-up event. Who knows, maybe there will be a whole sequence of events meant to disrupt. Just briefly, since the event blurb mentions the name Amanda Gorman, I would like to just pick on the name in some form here. And we were thinking, while conceptualizing this event, that the whole debate that was initiated with Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb, being translated here in the Netherlands by a non-Black author, and the controversy that this led to, and the whole debates that were initiated back then, were actually some kind of key moment in the translation business, where we started collectively asking who gets the chance to get translation offers. The debate was also turned around a bit and continued in a way where things were focused on essentialist identity politics. But in general, it was actually a chance to highlight how expertise is way too often marked as white. So that inspired our event. And having said so, I'd like to hand over the microphone to my co-host, who will also say a few words.
Thank you so much, Maha, and thank you so much to the Goethe Institute for having us, and to those who are here in person and online. And yeah, it's a real joy, as you say, to kind of continue the disruption conversation that we started already at the Goethe in January in an event with Elise Vajira and Elisa Diallo, talking about the structures of publishing houses in the Netherlands and in Germany. And it's interesting because, as Maha just said, my research really focuses more on the UK and the German context comparison, but because I am doing the project here, it's really important to me to also look at the Dutch context. And it's really great to be able to do that in community and in the public eye, to think together about the way that these strategies against exclusionary practices and discourses, to what extent these strategies are shared, to what extent they have to look differently a little bit in different contexts. My project and the kind of questions you ask in Vorzeichen have so many points already where they match, like when we talked about the conceptualizations of both. And I think one really key way in which they resonate is the question, like, how do we read now? Like, what do authors do? What do readers do? What does this relationship between readers and authors look like if you particularly think about authors from marginalized communities who have to navigate these publishing house structures? But I don't want to talk about that abstractly too much longer, but just say that I'm so happy that today we get to really focus on the translator as like this mediator in many ways between the author and the reader, and also the translator indeed as a key figure in how can we even think comparatively, because so often we wouldn't be able to do comparative work if we didn't have translators. So it is now my great joy to introduce the first of our guests for this event today, and that's Thalia Ostendorf, who is many things: a researcher, a publisher, a writer, a translator. And she currently holds a postdoctoral position here at the University of Amsterdam, where she researches the nature of kin relations between people of the African diaspora in Suriname and the Netherlands, whose ancestors were all enslaved at the same plantation. Thalia also holds a doctorate from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where she led a project on war literature and its influence on contemporary peace activism. Before that, she gained both her BA and her research master's at the University of Utrecht. So she's one of our star alumni, really. And together with two other former Utrecht literary studies students, Jaël van der Wouden and Sayonara Stuttgart, Thalia co-founded the Ausgabe Chaos, or Chaos Publishers, which is now an imprint of the larger independent publisher Das Mach, and it's the only intersectional feminist publishing house in the Netherlands. She does both editing and translating for Chaos, but also writes and translates other works, such as you can see here, Honoré Fanon Jeffers, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, which she co-translated in a team which was published last year. For now, just a warm welcome for you, Thalia.
And it is my pleasure to introduce the next guest, Jon Cho-Polizzi. Jon, you're Assistant Professor for Germanic Languages and Literature at the University of Michigan. And let me perhaps mention that you made it all the way from Michigan to Amsterdam via Berlin. So it is such a great pleasure, and it is a very special occasion to have you here. I'm very glad that this can happen the way we put it together for this evening. Jon, your research focuses on literary translation, as well as topics of migration, diversity, trans and multilingualism, and in the contemporary German-speaking world. You are working on a book project, it's tentatively titled Resistance, Resilience, Representation, Unmaking the Myth of Post-Wende German Identity. And since 2022, you have been faculty coordinator for the interdisciplinary working group called Alemannia, Transnational German Studies. You have indeed inspired the German context in many ways all across the Atlantic, also with the work for magazines at the time at UC Berkeley during your grad studies. So I remember how they have sparked debates in Germany all along the way, indeed. And you've translated, well, in my view, you are one of the most important translators of contemporary German literature. And I'm very glad that the German literary market has this talent of yours. You've translated several books, including Fatma Aydemir's Jins, Sharon Dodua-Otu's Ada's Room, Max Czolek's book De-Integrate, A Jewish Survival Guide for the 21st Century, and the anthology Your Homeland is Our Nightmare, an anti-fascist essay collection co-edited by Fatma Aydemir and Hengami Yacobi Farah. You were one of the translators who contributed to this edited volume being translated into English. And if I may also mention, it is thanks to you that this event series, it has a website, and the whole website has an English translation that exists thanks to you. So who knows, maybe we'll take things on a meta level in a way, since you also translated everything related to this project, including event announcements, blurbs, the concept, and so on and so forth. Jon, it is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much, both of you, for taking the time to be here.
And what I love just in hearing, introducing and hearing the introduction is that even from just your short bios, it's so visible how much both of you are also moving across both linguistic and national borders in your work. So while we're kind of officially comparing the Dutch and the German translation context, you're both bringing in so much knowledge about the US, the UK, the Scottish context, and even more that weren't even mentioned now in the introduction. So I'm really excited just to see how all these kind of comparative insights play out in our various questions. But I want to kick us off with a very foundational question, which is just, among all these things you do, what was, for both of you, what was your pathway into translation? How did you find yourself in that position of the translator?
I think the first translation actually that I started, I think, is this one here, is Sick Woman Theory, which was very much because we started our own publishing house, and getting things translated is quite expensive. And I sort of figured we'd try our hands at it and see how it went. And it kind of went better than I expected, because I remember sort of trying things like interpreting, and then sort of everything went so fast I couldn't keep up. But then translating and sort of sitting with the words, that made a lot more sense to me. So actually, sort of by creating our own work is how I rolled into translating. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of parallels in that story to my own sort of approach to translation. I initially actually did a master's degree in translation studies in Germany, but it was a degree that was much more geared towards sort of subject-specific technical translation and interpreting. And it was fairly clear to me early on that neither one of these were really my interest in translation. I was much more interested in literary translation, but it's a very difficult market to break into. And so I had been doing literary translations. I've been sort of volunteering at festivals in the German-speaking world and producing little short texts and things like that. But I also eventually wound up working for a literary journal, like an academic/literary journal, as a grad student. And I was very interested in publishing my own translations there as well. And the powers that be were very interested in this as well, and open to having this. This was something that had been done in the past with the journal, but being someone that was very interested in promoting new voices in German literature, sort of forgotten or overseen voices, and having already kind of a network of people that I knew were involved in similar projects, I tried to always sneak translations into all the publications that we did, and use this as sort of a channel to promote authors that I thought were doing interesting things, authors whose work was overlooked in sort of English-speaking academia. And this eventually evolved into a special issue of the journal that was a translation of Eure Heimat ist unser Albtraum, which is the book on the left there, probably for the audience. And this was sort of like a collective project done with both professional and amateur translators, students, academics, but also just full-time translators who were very invested in the essays in this collection. And we were not really aware at the time that it would receive the kind of attention that it did. But making this text available and also making it available in an open access way suddenly really changed the conversation in the US, I think, in many ways, or just the English-speaking world, about what was happening in German literature. So I think there was also this sort of DIY initiative, but also really an interest in making this stuff widely available.
I often hear from translators who are at the beginning of their career this question with, like, how do you get a translation under contract? And to be honest with you, even I, who is not in the translation business, I often wonder about the same thing. How does that happen? So I thought to seize this chance and ask both of you, maybe first thing, how do you choose the texts that you would like to spend a fair amount of time working on, and how do you get your translation under contract?
Sure, we should start.
We can switch off.
I think so. Before, or actually, sort of during when we started the publishing house, I was still working as a project manager at a sort of translation company. But they did translations for sort of the business world. So like things that you hear, like in the voiceover, it's Schiphol, that sort of stuff was done by freelancers that we worked with. And I noticed there that quite a lot of people, you just put in a lot of free work, not necessarily for anyone yet. You sort of decide that this is what I would like to translate. You sort of research whether it's out there already. And if it's not, you sort of try, you do that first and then sort of try and find interest in it. I know that in the Netherlands, there's a relatively new grant, sort of very much on the heels of the whole sort of government situation that you mentioned, that sort of allows younger or sort of less experienced translators to get a grant for the first, I think, 4 chapters or something. And so that you sort of can buy your own time to do that and then go by publishing houses and sort of pitch it. But I think a lot of the time, sort of that looks different again as a publisher when I'm sort of trying to decide what would be interesting to get out there. And I do that, I think mostly sort of I look at things that I remember reading at uni. So actually quite a lot of older texts where sort of why have I only seen this in English? And even that usually is translated from somewhere else. And the other part is that now I know a couple of translators who I worked with on this book, for example. So I sort of talk to them and we discuss things that we would like to see more, and we sort of see how the rights work and who owns the rights and how to get them, which is the most annoying part of all of it. It takes up so much time, and sometimes it just goes nowhere because then the rights go somewhere else. But sort of, so there's all these sort of different ways and avenues to try and see if something's available. And if you think there would be interest, sort of, I look with other people, sort of, do we think that this could work, and do we know someone? Because at this point, I don't have that much time to translate myself, so I then talk to the other translators I know, thinking, do you have time to do this in the foreseeable future? And would you like to work on this and sit with it? But I think sort of breaking into it is a very difficult step. I don't know about Germany, but in the Netherlands, there's a lot of very established, not even a lot, but like a number of established translators. And because then they have a good track record, they keep getting asked. And it's really hard to sort of break into that. When you're younger, especially when you're a person of color, it's sort of, there's all these hurdles that make it harder for someone to people won't really ask you if you don't have a CV. So yeah, this is one of the sort of tricky things, I think.
Yeah, I think that answer really tracks. There are certainly scholarships available to translators, but they're very few in number. And I think a lot of the scholarships that are available, for example, through an organization like the Goethe Institute, they go more towards paying for the costs of the translation from the publishing side, buying the rights, paying for the actual printing, and not necessarily going as much towards paying the translator. So it's a very difficult market to break into. I think a lot of publishers in the English-speaking world kind of expect you to send in 20 to 50 pages of the work in advance, just for their consideration. The more you've translated, the more likely they are to take your sort of submission serious. They also probably are going to want you to translate advertising kind of material and maybe provide, summaries and book reviews and things like that. So you have to come up with like a very substantial portfolio just to submit and see if there's interest. And, submitting it is absolutely no guarantee that there is interest or that you'll even necessarily hear back from a publishing house. So starting out, not coming from a place where you have a name in the field, where you have connections in the field, where you necessarily have money to live off of on your own while you're hoping for a contract, is, I think, the primary hurdle for a lot of new people to get involved in the translation world. There are also a number of very established translators of German language literatures, many of whom are also very talented. And so it's hard to ask a publisher to kind of take a gamble on work that you're doing if you're not someone that's already established in the field. So a lot of the work that winds up happening is free, it's voluntary. You're much more likely to publish short works in a literary magazine, in an online journal, things like that. So I think starting out, it's really necessary to put in a lot of work and hope for some sort of teasers of interest, most of which will be sort of unpaid labor. On the other side of this, however, I think coming out of the success of a project like Eure Heimat ist unser Albtraum, Your Homeland is Our Nightmare, which was, of course, also completely voluntary. Many of us who worked on this went on to continue to work with the authors that we translated for this project. It gave a lot of us who were sort of starting out, POC translators, connections to authors that were meaningful connections. We were very invested in the works that we were translating, and in sort of being more participatory in the conversations that were happening around these authors. And I think for me, I can only really speak for myself in this situation. Several of the authors in this collection went on to be authors who I've translated books for. So that was sort of an unexpected connection, but a very meaningful connection that came out of doing the sort of more voluntary work. But I think it was a matter of being quite invested in the project and caring a lot about it, and having that feeling then reciprocated with the authors that we work with, who could sort of recognize that a lot of us were really invested in what they were doing.
Fantastic. I want to pick up there with a question again, going back to what Maha said about the Gorman debate, which was in the media framed so much as this who can translate whom on a kind of spiritual level debate, right? And then it got criticized for being essentialist, when really what started the whole debate here in the Netherlands, right, was this article in the Volkskrant, I think, read by Janice Doyle, where she criticized, specifically didn't criticize the chosen translation, but said like, oh, but kind of this would have been such a great opportunity. We have so much talent here, particularly so many young Black spoken word artists who could have really captured Gorman's style. And why is this talent being passed over? So it really started as a debate about who gets these opportunities, and that resonated so much with what you both said about the networks are so established, and if you're not in them, it's incredibly hard to break in. Now, what I find interesting is that both of your stories of getting into translation are very much around you kind of, in many ways, created your own opportunities, like through the publishing house, through the journal transit. And I was wondering how, now that you're kind of leading a publishing house, or also like more established in the German scene, do you kind of have it very much like on your radar? Like, are you now creating specifically such opportunities, or how do you do that in your respective roles?
Can I add a note about the Gorman thing? Because somehow in the media, it's sort of, however big it was, there was like one essential thing I think that got lost, which is that the translator, the white translator that they asked, is on record in several newspapers joking about how bad their English is. So it's very much like someone who said themselves they weren't good at this thing that they were then asked to do. So it's very much like talent that might be out there that is maybe quiet versus someone who's loudly not capable, and then still asking that person because it's sort of this idea that prestige sells books more than anything else, kind of. I'm just going to add that, and then you can start with the question.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that is actually sort of something that you see happening in the translation world, right, where you choose someone who's not necessarily a translator, but maybe an established writer, and you say, well, this is someone who's famous, so why don't we get them to co-translate something with someone and have another translator do the work, and then we can put their name on it too, and then it looks like it's been done by this sort of established literary great.
Whose name comes first.
Whose name comes first. And I mean, I don't think that was the case with this particular translation, but this is a very common practice where the actual practice of translation is not what's valued. It's sort of the product that comes out of it and what names can be associated with it, where a lot of actual literary translators' names don't appear on the cover of the book, or maybe don't even appear on the inside cover of the book and are just a footnote somewhere, because that labor is not necessarily, I mean, it's changing, but that labor is not necessarily respected in the publishing world, at least traditionally. To get back to your question, I'm very invested, I would say, in expanding the field of literary translation. Yeah, I get a lot of requests now, and working also full-time in academia, it's not possible to translate, as many books as I would like to translate. And I'm very happy to recommend other translators, young translators, translators of color who are invested in the discourses that are involved in these books and who I know will do a good job, but would not necessarily be on the radar of publishing houses. At the same time, I feel like the requests are often quite performative. Like I'll get a request from a publishing house asking me, can you recommend, a translator of this ethnic background with this, socioeconomic background, with this age level, this, and it's like, you're trying to create something here, or at least you're gesturing towards it, but its specificity is not really relevant to the larger questions. And I think it feels very performative, like it's a box that we checked, or we didn't find someone that fits this exact identity category. Oh, well, we're going to give it to the person that we always work with now. And I feel like that's really frustrating, where there's a gesture being made, but it's not the right gesture. And I think it's much more important to create new opportunities, to allow new voices into the field, and to also look for people who are invested in the discourse. It doesn't matter if the identity categories match one-to-one. It matters that something about the experiential process codes or relates or maps. And I think the call was made to diversify the field of translation, but it was not a call made to find translators whose identity categories map one-to-one with the author, because that's not possible.
Yeah, maybe also sort of the idea of diversifying. It doesn't seem to quite hit on, okay, so then who is, for example, studying to be a translator? Not that you necessarily, I think, always need to go through that, but I feel like in the Netherlands, it feels almost like we're sort of a step behind what you're saying, where there's just so few people of color in translation. And part of that is just like the amount of free work it takes to sort of get in there. So like you do then need another job, of course, to sort of live off, and then you try and build this portfolio. On top of which, a lot of translation, they want it really, really quickly. So there's a lot of jobs, if you do get them offered, you'll have to turn it down because they're like, could we get this by September? And you're like, well, no, because I live in work already. I'm not just sitting here waiting for this email. But that's very much sort of the way it comes at you from sort of big publishing houses. And so there's a few people, like I said, that I worked with on the love songs that we're still in touch, and we sort of I try and give them work because I think they're very good, and they should have more work. And like I said, some plans sort of fall through, but it feels like I'm still sort of in that circle of the context that I made then. And even I think almost all of them are sort of still having other jobs. We all do, because translation doesn't pay that much, and because it sort of requires you to upend your life like that because of deadlines. You're not always able to take all those opportunities. And I'm not even entirely sure sort of in terms of like MAs in translation as sort of who is currently there, because it's just so much work to even get like a project off the ground and sort of, like I said, figure out the rights. And sort of all these things that come sort of with the fact that we decided to do a publishing house, for example, rather than a magazine, where I think all of that would be much easier and you could sort of get your feelers out way more. And I think we have sort of, through deciding to publish books, sort of set ourselves in a corner where like some things are more difficult, and sort of some ideas then are sometimes too big or will just take a longer time. But it's sort of in essence absolutely trying to sort of create opportunities for the people that I've met in this field, who also just have more experience than I do. Because like we worked, for example, with Nomi Mettendorf, who's one of the 5 translators here as well, and she has a formal translation education, and she wrote her master thesis on translating the African American vernacular. And so we would sort of have these group meetings, and I would learn so much from the work she'd already done, and sort of the work that she's still doing, that it sort of actually makes so much sense that, yes, I don't have time, but also I think she's the better translator, and then sort of try and funnel work her way, kind of.
Thank you. And I was going to follow up also with another question based on the Gorman debate, which is just to say that, of course, it's no coincidence at all that the whole debate took place in 2021, so not even a whole year after the Black Lives Matter movement, and also the protests after George Floyd's murder. And there was this moment then of very genuine disruption across the board, including in publishing, that was then fairly quickly kind of like taken by publishing houses and kind of to be put in a disruption that's more containable, or one that they can respond to and say like, okay, we're also aware of publishing's racism problem, of translation's racism problem, of just generally everything being very white. And then there were all these initiatives, and some of them are still going and are very positive, but I think this year it's particularly visible to me that some of these initiatives have like run out of steam or there's real backlash against them. As like I think one of the few Black publishing executives in the States who was kind of like hailed as like now the hope of like diversity in publishing was very unceremoniously let go just 2 weeks ago. Lisa Lucas, who's been doing amazing work and was very successful at it, but was just restructuring. She's gone. In Germany, there was this big debate about price juries are so white. They were changed. There's this one jury now that for literally like 1 year it was like one of the most diverse juries, more people of color authors and white people in a jury, and now 1 year later there's a big media scandal about like that they're surely too biased, and there are all these articles. So I feel like just 2024 we're kind of at the point where you can see the 2021 thing kind of like it already seems to have been too much for many onlookers at least. And so I was really interested to hear how both of you have experienced this kind of roller coaster of the sudden enthusiastic lip service towards disruption and diversifying and so forth, but then also, like the way that this moment has stalled again, and how that has, how you've experienced that in your careers and environments.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think lip service is perhaps a good way to describe it. I think that there have been efforts made, but they have often appeared to be quite superficial. And then I think there are genuine hurdles that are maybe not always the ones that one might expect. I can think of a case where I was asked to translate from an author that the publishers deemed that I had a similar background to, which is, fair and interesting. But the author did not wind up wanting to go with my translation. They preferred to go with a translator that they had worked with in the past, which is an interesting thing because the language was more familiar, and they were perhaps more inclined to go with what seemed like the way that their work had been received already in the English-speaking world, which I think is an interesting thing, right? Because this institutional bias also impacts the author's decisions, right? They may be less likely to want to take a risk if something seems unfamiliar about the language. On the other hand, I've had quite a few experiences where authors have really wanted their publishers to choose me to either work for just writing like a Übersetzung, like a sample translation, to be shipped around and shopped at other English-speaking publishing houses, or the rights have been sold and authors sort of have asked if the publishing houses would work with me. And my experience is generally that publishing houses have authors that they want to work with, translators that they want to work with, on both sides of the Atlantic. So a German publisher is likely to say, well, we have these 3 translators that always do our sample translations, so we're going to just go with them. But if we sell them, maybe we can say that you suggested this other author. But if someone else has already translated a significant portion of the book, it's unlikely that a publishing house will buy it and say, okay, you've already done 50 pages, but we're going to choose this other person we don't know. So it creates this sort of structural hurdle then, or a material hurdle, where there's just no logical reason for a publisher to choose someone else. And I think the will of the author is often superseded by the established pecking order, so to speak. And this has been sort of a disappointing experience that I've encountered quite a few times. And it takes a very particular author and also perhaps a certain positionality or privilege to be able to say, no, this translation must be done by this translator. Because in most cases, I mean, at least going into the US American market, between less than 1% and maybe 3%, like the statistics differ a little bit, but a very, very tiny amount of the overall books that are published on the US book market are translations. Like some people say 0.8%. I've read 3%, but in any case, it's a very, very small number. So if your book is chosen to be published, to be translated, it's very unlikely you're going to say, no, like not unless my friend translates it for you. Like it's such a privilege already to make it into this book market that you're not likely to make another intervention there, which I also completely understand, but it makes it very difficult for an author to have any leverage.
Yeah, and I can imagine maybe also quite a lot of the time the author just isn't asked, sort of in all these languages that they don't speak.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, this will be the Romanian translation and this person will do it.
Totally.
And sort of everything's aligned for you to be like, okay. And then that's sort of, that's that kind of.
Yeah.
In terms of sort of that 2021 was it 21? And 2024 sort of art. I feel so. The love songs of W.E. Du Bois were by the same. It's by the same publisher that published Gorman's poems. So this was very much a very direct answer to sort of, we're going to do this differently. We're going to have young translators of color, and we were paired with two sort of way more established authors, translators. And there was like sort of a mentorship thing in place, so that because we had less experience, that we could sort of both discuss with the translator who was there just for us, who was not of color, but like they were there for us, and then we would also discuss amongst ourselves, especially with this book because it's sort of set in the American South in the last like 400 years. So in terms of language and subject, there was so much to sort of trip over, basically. And it's beautiful, but there was sort of a lot of intricacies that we, at times, even sort of with the whole mentorship thing in place, at times the three of us would sort of get together. So I'm half Surinamese, and one of the other authors, translators, again, half Surinamese and the other Surinamese, and all grew up in the Netherlands. And so we sort of would come together and be like, I actually feel quite strongly about like not using this word. And then we'd like, yeah, okay, we should email again. And then we sort of would come together and try and sort of push certain things, which I think in most, if not all cases, they kind of went with their suggestions. But it was also in part because we kept bringing up things that sort of sometimes seemed to almost slip. And then we were like, no, actually, that's, we're still not. We strongly advise against it. The whole conversation about the N-word took so many emails. Is amazing because you'd think we're on the same page, but apparently not. But in the end we were, which was good. But it's also, and I think they also did a good job in terms of offering us, like I said, the mentorship, but there are also some, like the grant I mentioned that was new, where they sort of decided, the Dutch Literary Fund sort of decided to create this grant for if you want more experience and then like have time and money to pitch it. And we could sort of enter into that, enter in a pitch for that, which I think technically we didn't qualify for through some whatever, but they were sort of expanding the edges of that to sort of give us an extra leg up, basically. I didn't have time for that because I was also trying to finish a PhD at the time, but it was, I did notice that sort of they tried a lot of extra things, so it was more sustainable. And I remember after this came out, or sort of wasn't in the pipelines, basically, there were a few requests for one or two for translations, which I then, again, BC didn't have time for. Personally, after that, I could sort of see that things shift from the perspective of being asked as a translator. I think also because there's that weird thing where you have to sort of keep publishing to sort of stay visible and in demand, whereas on the other side, of course, we're publishing ourselves. And so, as in not my own stuff, but like we are publishers, and therefore we retain the contacts with everybody else. And so like one of my co-translators is now a co-translator on another book, The Safekeep, that came out, and that's come through that work relationship. But yeah, I think in terms of public opinion, also, of course, politically, everything's gone through such a hard right shift that it's sort of, I wonder what sort of comes of these initiatives, because I feel like part of it happened is because at the time the loudest voices and most visible voices seem to sort of want this, and I feel like now the loudest voices are like so fascist that sort of, I wonder if maybe these sort of more established places will be like, well, now we don't need to, because if we actually look at the people, or listen to the people, then they just want Dutch things, and so we're going to do that. So I'm not sure if that's going to happen, or if they're going to try and stick to that. Also because publishing is in such a bad space, especially Dutch publishing. There's like TVK Media, which is like conglomerate that got bought by Simon & Schuster. So there's going to be more English books on the market. And so there's this whole thing where there's never that much money to be made in publishing. But if it's become even harder, then sort of the books that they consider to be a gamble will become rare. And I think that's a tricky, I feel like, we'll probably see that happening, would be my guess.
If I may partly follow up and partly throw in a couple of further keywords. I'm interested in the speaker series, in the intersection of scholarship and academia, and the publishing business and the literary market in general. I think one of the main differences that pop up to my mind when I think of both is speed. Like the literary market and the publishing business work very hard, much with speed. Something that is a timely topic today is outdated by tomorrow. I think this is where perhaps the work of a literary critic and a translator overlap when they try to pitch, and a text or a topic is 6 weeks old or something, then now chances are lower to be successful with the pitch. Whereas in academia, things look a bit different. You've also already mentioned, Thalia, that sometimes you work on historical texts, like you go back in history and you want to maybe translate older texts. And I'm curious to hear from both of you, actually, how you approach this, like how you approach discovering and delving into historical or older texts, and how you work along with that when you want to work on a translation of these texts.
Think about that. I feel like for me, in part, it's a practical decision, in part because that speed sort of freaks me out a little bit, and because publishing house is one of the things I do, and it's not the thing that brings in the money that I live off. And so to try and be there with the speed is sort of almost impossible for me, if not just impossible. And then so the step to sort of be a bit calmer and look at the things that are already there but potentially overlooked, which maybe I hadn't considered was overlooked because I read them in English, for example. I'm using that as a tactic to sort of see what's there, see what's been like important or inspirational or foundational to me, and if that's sort of available here outside of the foreign languages. But I think in part it's just a tactical life decision.
Yeah. I guess most of the books that I've translated have been very contemporary, or at least have been published in the last 5 years, let's say. Not, translated in the year of publishing, but shortly thereafter. And something that I have noticed is that while, contract negotiations may drag on for long periods of time, and the deadlines tend to be quite short after the contract is negotiated, it's not necessarily the case that the book then comes out immediately. Like, it may sit on the publisher's shelf for a year or a year and a half. So there is a bit of a discrepancy in terms of like the feeling of urgency that you are presented with as translator versus the editorial and printing process. This has at least sort of been my observation. But in terms of going back and looking at older works, I think that there are a few things that make this both more complicated and potentially easier. One is that, at least in the English-speaking context, a lot of older works have been translated already. They may have been translated poorly. The translations may not be available anymore, but it is likely in most cases that someone has at least worked on a text before. So there may be some sort of skeleton of a translation available. There may be a scholarly work on the text that, provides some translations. There tends to be something available which can be helpful as a translator to have this sort of resource. But then again, if it's within a certain period of time, can also mean that you cannot acquire the rights to the work. So it can kind of be there's a sweet spot at which a work is so old that the publishing rights are available, and so new that the publishing rights are available. And then there's this period of time where it's quite difficult to acquire them. So I have not really had the experience of trying to publish an entire older work, but excerpts of a work, chapter, essays, things like that. I think there tends to be a lot of interest because you can put an older work into a new context and you can sort of bring it into conversation with things that are happening today and sort of reinvigorate it in a way, or maybe find a work that was deemed irrelevant at its time and suddenly bring it into conversation with a discourse that's happening today, and suddenly it gains new relevance. So there's certainly a value to that. And I know that there are actually a few projects in Germany right now to sort of like find these books that were banned or that sort of went out of print very quickly because they were written in the first half of the 20th century and fell under some sort of censorship. And so there is this sort of like archival interest in rediscovering German language literature from the first half of the 20th century. And I would guess that when these publishing houses start bringing out more of these texts, that there may be an increased interest in making some of these available. But it won't be a matter of sort of how they are presented, how they are received in the German-speaking world first. And it's open to different levels of difficulty, I think. Because if a work is deemed suddenly relevant again, then maybe the rights will be purchased. I can't personally speak about what the actual experience is like to uncover a work and try to bring it back to the surface. I've done some work like this in my scholarly research, and then certainly I provide lengthy translations, but I've never really tried to publish like a historical book. So I don't know that I would be positioned to really speak on that.
I've tried this. I've had 2 books where I tried this and it didn't work because someone snagged it from under my desk with more money.
Yes.
Just basically just offering more money and then it was gone.
And this were these cases where interest suddenly was reawakened in a way?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Whereas I feel like no one was talking about it, and now that I mentioned it, like 8 months go by and suddenly another publisher is publishing it.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, okay, so you're friends. That's very frustrating. Yeah. Absolutely. And especially sort of in terms of like wanting to put it in context. Yeah. It's sort of, it's very frustrating. You feel like you know the right people to maybe speak on this or give a sort of a forward or we with House we published like letter exchanges in front of sort of previously published books, and sort of to give a little bit more context. We started out, the first book we published was A Room of One's Own, where you had the exact thing you talked about, that someone else published this. They came to us with the idea. It was brilliant, Monique van den Berg, and she said, hey, A Room of One's Own does exist in Dutch, but the last translation is from 1957. Yeah. So maybe we want to do that again. So she did, and because she was an established translator, she knew sort of the pathways to funding for herself, so she could do it in a way that sort of supported the publishing house. And then we sort of added letters to that, hoping that it was sort of by modern day authors and an academic, sort of trying to give context to, of course, Virginia Woolf's very specific space from which she wrote, and to maybe critique it a little bit and not just sort of throw it out there. As is and not comment. But that is, I think, also a fun part of sort of bringing the historical text back. Because even the texts that I think are tricky, we did a translation of How It Feels to Be Colored Me, which Sayonara, she translated a text, I translated the letters with it. And I've always thought that was a tricky text, but then if you sort of bring it in conversation, it sort of, it gives it so much more than just sort of these I was very worried for parts of the text just being thrown out there as sound bites and as like justifications for things. And then it does help to also for myself to think about it sort of in conversation with a larger field. Yeah.
But I'm also thinking like, even when not going back as far as the beginning of the 20th century, but even like the 1990s or perhaps 80s, I'm thinking, for instance, for the German context of the so-called erased archives of migration, like books that never made it to a public, like that are part of rather informal bookstores, which are the basements in some Kreuzberg apartment in Berlin or in former West Berlin. So I'm even thinking about all this heritage that never made it to publishing or to translation, and then perhaps without being translated, there is no chance to make it to academic curricula, like university curricula and so on, outside Germany or outside the Netherlands. So I was even thinking about, one, those erased archives, perhaps in Germany, and let's say, for instance, your work right now, Jon, your research on networks of authors, activists, journalists, writers after the fall of the Berlin Wall, how this work also on influences or has an impact and informs your research, perhaps on multi-directional histories. And with you, Thalia, I'm like your current research project is on Dutch language Surinamese literature, and you go as back as the 1980s. So I was thinking about the same thing, about how your translation probably opens up like new path towards remembrance and a new rewriting of these histories of the 1980s and 90s. I'm rather curious to hear more about this intersection of translation and multi-directional memories by unveiling archives or by making visible those invisible archives of Dutch or of Dutch Surinamese histories and German, non-German histories.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a way in which a huge amount of Germany's sort of celebrated memory culture is actually quite provincial and very much centered in one particular understanding of what it meant to be Germany, what it meant to be German, what it meant to experience particular moments in German history. And this has largely gone, I wouldn't say without any attention, but has been largely ignored in sort of national narratives. And this is because a lot of these stories, as you say, are not available or are only privately available or have not been considered worthy of archiving. And so making visible the different sort of narrative threads that have informed post-unification Germany is really a matter of tracing the networks of migration, tracing the traditions that influenced, the writers and the artists that came to Germany in the second half of the 20th century, and making room for this sort of literature that is written in German in Germany, but which is not considered part of the German national tradition, although it may in fact be informed by many other literary traditions and have brought these sort of discourses and these literary threads into the German language literary tradition. The lack of understanding of those continuities means that for a larger German language reception or the sort of canonization process that happens in Germany, if it's not clear where these traditions are coming from, the trajectories are often ignored or it's deemed to be somehow not German. And so there is a way in which the archival work of a translator could be very important to this, but this is not necessarily meaning translating things out of German, but also translating a lot of things into German that may have been written in Germany by people who were participating in rebuilding Germany as a modern state, but who perhaps didn't have German as a first language or as a literary language. And I think this is sort of we talked about multi-directional memory, but it's also a multi-directional translation because a lot of these things are undeniably part of German history, but may not be available in the German language to begin with. And I think this is an additional aspect of it that really needs to be considered, but largely to sort of think about making these texts available, not just in German, but also perhaps in English, English being a language of international scholarship. It also would help to rethink German cultural memory as a practice, as a sort of celebrated, national heritage in Germany, and help to perhaps de-provincialize the way in which certain understandings of what German memory is have come to dictate the narrative of what is allowed to be remembered and valued.
I think in terms of the research that I'm doing now, the literary corpus I'm looking at, it comes from this Surinamese author called Reihe. He was born in 1948 and he died in 2000. He was born in Suriname, died in Amsterdam. And sort of his most productive years in terms of publication were sort of from the late 60s to sort of throughout the 80s. And he had all kinds of modes of publication. He self-published a bunch of stuff. He published in Suriname, in Surinamese Creole. That was his first book. And then after he came to the Netherlands, he sort of started publishing in what people sort of call Cairogian Surinamese Dutch. So he made a very singular mix of Surinamese, Creole, and Dutch, and had that published here in the Knipsker mostly. This publisher, who publishes a lot of Caribbean literature. But the thing with Dutch language Caribbean literature, mostly Dutch language Caribbean literature, is that it's just in complete isolation, kind of. It's so much of it has never been translated, full stop. But definitely not, as sort of you said, English as a academic language. Sort of, it's never made that jump to being available for analysis.
Yeah.
Which means that this whole region sort of remains like the sort of, I don't know if anyone ever played Age of Empires, but sort of that thing on the map where it's just like, so remains black unless you walk there. I work in this archives literary estate has been given to the Dutch Museum of Literature in The Hague, and I'm cataloging that. And it's so interesting to see what's there and what's been published, what's not been published, letters, all that sort of all kind of like film scripts and stuff like that. But it's also very strange to then be one of two, sometimes the only person writing about him, which feels like it should be some kind of academic dream because there's nobody else sort of like trying to take my spot. But at the same time, it makes it impossible to have a conversation about sort of what I think this work might mean, and which I feels very risky because then I can say something and no one can counter, because I put in the Dutch Surinamese, which then can only be read because I add my own not very sort of thorough English translation. So it also feels very sticky to me, where I probably do make claims that if there were even five other people in the field, they'd be like, "Oh, are you sure?" But there's sort of no one there to do it because it's so isolated. So I try to be careful and sort of mention that in the text as well. But it is just me at the minute, and part of that is to do with translation. Because maybe even if the interest in Dutch language Caribbean literature in the Netherlands isn't that big, because it's a very small field, I feel like there would be an interest on an international level where there's all these sort of the negritude and the sort of more towards Gisans. There's so many sort of theoretical frameworks that are already Caribbean that it could be sort of taken into and compared to, but it's sort of not yet possible because it's just there in Dutch. And that, I think that's a very tricky, it's just a weird corner to be in. And I think the work definitely deserves to have a bigger reach than it has at the minute. But sort of even if it has a bigger reach and it gets, because so much of it you can't find anymore because it's no longer in print. So even in Dutch, it's hard to find. And one of his books is getting reprinted by a new publisher, by a different publisher than his previous one. But that is still just the Netherlands, basically. And it, especially on an academic level, it'd be so interesting if I could sort of send this to people I know in the field and be like, what do you think? And we talk about this. But if we sort of have to go by the translations that I make while I'm writing an article, that's very different than the time and attention I give it if I sort of translate his entire work. So I feel weird about that too. Just feeling weird about a lot of things. But so that is, it feels like I said, it feels sticky because it is, you do sort of do it quickly and try not to do it badly, but it is sort of to illustrate what it says in a very literal way and not trying to translate literarily, which I do think it deserves. It's just sort of, I can't quite do that if I'm just looking at things. Exactly,
I want to pick up on, I find it so fascinating, the kind of isolation you describe and the issues and the like craving for exchange with others who you could kind of talk about this with, while at the same time you also describe like the collaborative praxis of translating this book. And just one thing we noticed when we prepared this event was how much both of you are really working in communities, so be that through this like 5 people co-translation, co-founding the publishing house with 2 others, and your work on the already a collection that you then translated as a collective, but also the authors whose full novels you've translated, Sharon Dedeau, Max Czolek, Fatma Aydemir, are kind of themselves in a kind of solidarity network. So that there are all these communities and very much also communities of solidarity. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about like the role or the commitment to collaborative practice and what that means for you in your work as translators.
Yeah, I mean, I think you already summed it up fairly well. I think my entry into the field of literary translation really happened as a collective project. And I think that many of us who worked on this book together have become friends through this project. I mean, we may have known each other already, but we really worked together very closely. We tried to come up with a shared vocabulary for translating difficult concepts. Sometimes we agreed to disagree, but there was always a conversation around not just our individual works, but how these works would be in conversation as part of a collective volume. And I think that this, in some ways, may have mapped onto the process of the original book, right? These were authors who knew each other, but didn't necessarily all know each other well, but they were all very invested in critiquing the growing conversations around participation in the German homeland, right? And I think through this project, the connections that many of the German language authors already had were strengthened to the extent that a lot of them now tour together. They've written introductions for each other's new book projects. They frequently do stage appearances in Berlin together. They critique each other's work. They write recommendations for each other's work. They really became this sort of kinship network. And I think there was a recognition that we were very invested in doing something similar, also in providing a wide range of translational voices. Like, this is an extremely intersectional book, and we wanted the network of translators to also reflect that. Not to the extent that we felt that we had to always try to map identity categories onto one another, but it was very important to us that, one, it represented a wide range of demographics, a wide range of experience as translators, and just a wide range of positionalities. And I think that process also resulted in us forming, in some ways, kinship bonds as translators, to the extent that many of us, will recommend each other for projects that we think are well suited to each other. Quite a few of us have gone on to, have jobs in academia, and we try to promote each other's work. We try to teach each other's work. We try to invite each other to events, and really make sure that these sort of collective impulses that came out of this initial project become part of our practice as academics, and then become part of our practice as translators, so that we don't eventually fall into the same norms that we tried to break out of in creating this project. And I think that this is an ongoing thing. I think that both the authors and a lot of the translators are invested in making this an ongoing thing. And we still try to stay in communication with each other, and we still try to work on these projects together. Yeah.
I think actually probably most, if not all of what I do that I think is important, I don't do alone. It's sort of, it's almost it's either collaboration with one person or with a group, or sort of, I think in part, for example, I feel like in academia, it has a lot to do with, you can sort of feel very lonely in certain spaces. There's, like Utrecht is not diverse at all. Sort of, I remember Sayonara because we had one course together, but also because we nodded at each other in the hallway. It was like us and 3 other like girls who were mixed race or black, and like that was it. So like, and that in that situation, isolation is not good, and so you look for these bonds, and sort of collaboration, I think, comes from that sort of almost like solidarity, where we are aware we're in this together. And I think that much just like what I described happened with the book, in terms of like talking about the certain words and things, where we sort of, the 3 of us would get together. Okay, so I don't think, yeah, okay. And then we sort of after that would go to sort of the people who were officially making the decisions. And I think it's just even things like writing fiction and stuff like that. I feel, especially in the Netherlands, there's this idea of like author sits in attic, writes genius book, and comes down the stairs with it. And everything I know about writing is just like through, I write something, a friend of mine reads it, they give me something, I can read of theirs, you talk about it, and it's sort of, even academic and stuff, so there's always friends that will read an article and just be like, oh yeah, maybe look at this, didn't understand that. There's so much, trying not to think of a word that is not related to work, but there's so much like, such like giving in terms of time and effort for other people that I think that's what made it a lot. If no one had ever read my academic work, I probably wouldn't have been able to like finish PhD, because you sort of, that's how you get better. So I think, yeah, everything's done in collaboration. Yeah. Just because I don't know how else to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I could just comment on that again, I kind of have a problem with this concept of expertise, right? Like this is really a buzzword in academia, right? We're presented and positioned as experts on a given subject, but I think something that translation teaches you is that you're never an expert on everything in a given subject. There's always room to learn things. There's always something you don't know, and there's always something someone else can do better. And that's a very hard realization to make sometimes, because we are sort of conditioned to present ourselves, or to at least desire to be able to present ourselves as experts. And the sort of collaborative work that you do as a translator, particularly work doing contemporary literature where you maybe are actually in conversation with the author, it really reinforces the fact that this sort of concept of the individual expertise is very flawed. And the ability to take a step back from that and sort of recognize the value of a collaborative authorship is a really, I think, important step that would take scholarship further. And this is something that I think you really get out of literary work, literary translation, is this, I mean, and it can, of course, then impact your scholarly practices. I think in an ideal case it does, but I think for a lot of people, it's difficult to acknowledge the extent to which collaboration is what makes your work good on an individual level.
I'm wondering if it's the right moment to open the discussion. Probably the online audience might need a moment to type in questions if there are any. We will get assistance here and have them read out loud, but of course you're also most welcome to ask questions for those people who are here together with us in the room, if you'd like to. Simply would give me a sign if there are questions in the chat, right? And maybe until everyone has typed in the question, or Jonas, oh, please.
Yeah, thank you all so much. That was a really engaging talk. I've got lots of thoughts going on. I was going to ask about collaboration, so I'm glad that you brought that up. But I guess I'm just thinking more about. I mean, I really agree with you against this idea of the expert and of translation. I think as a practice that really fundamentally reveals how literary creation is always collaborative in some way. However, this is an industry that really makes money from the idea of the individual, both the individual author, but also the individual named translator, if it's a big name. Same for academia, right? I also work in academia and have my best moments and do my best work when I'm collaborating, but then I'm competing against my collaborators in order to get the funding or the publication or the post or whatever. So my question to you then is, how do you balance the everyday practice of community building as an act of disruption in your practice, while at the same time, still within this structure which really values the idea of the individual author, the individual, which is in itself a really, if you think about the idea of the canon, right, and also a very intensely racist, colonial, patriarchal idea of what gets to be counted as literature, and how do you kind of balance that?
I feel like you're well positioned in thinking about like the publishing house and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the idea of sort of that you're working together, but also they're competitors, I think is very interesting, but also tricky to me still, because I'm also new to it, because I finished my PhD nearly 2 years ago, the postdoc is 2 years. I have like a little over half a year left. So at this point, I don't yet feel like I'm competing, ? It just doesn't quite, I feel like in the end, it doesn't quite feel important. And I've actually thought about this quite a bit recently, because I did this project and I ended up just having a massive argument with two of the people there, because I thought they were being quite racist. And then I just like left in a huff and like blocked everyone. And I've been thinking about like why I feel comfortable doing that. And I think part of it is that I do so many different things that at the end of the day, I can always think like, well, I don't need you. I think you think I need you, but I don't actually need you, because if it's not this, then I'll do that. And that's so while it's like I'm constantly stretched super thin, it gives me a lot of freedom, because I'm not all my eggs are in the academic basket. And if like it doesn't work out in the Netherlands, I know that I can go abroad, because I've done that before for like a project that I loved. So I feel like that quite helps in sort of the context that I then have, or just all people that are excited about the thing, but they're also not necessarily in the same places. So a lot of the people that I know in Caribbean studies aren't in the Netherlands or interested in ever moving to the Netherlands. And so they're not my competitors. We can be co-workers. And in the Netherlands, that field is so small that it's sort of, it's not even sort of not, the competition is almost not even worth mentioning. There will be the moment that Michiel van Kempen just retired, who's like the guy for Dutch Caribbean literature. I'm sure there'll be like some tussle of when like who's going to take his post, but at the same time, none of us know what's going to happen with that post, and so it's just all we can do is like continue doing the work, kind of. So yeah, sorry, that's not a complete answer, but it does. I feel like part of the collaboration thing is that it's so in so many places that it allows me to either open or close certain doors when I sort of don't like it. So, because sometimes in the competition also things happen that aren't like, don't feel like, make me feel like that's not the place where I want to be. Like if that's the vibe that's going on in that field or in that department, then yeah, I'd have a job that doesn't end in 6 months, but also then certain people are my coworkers, and like, do you want that? Or, but I guess that's also just because for me, academia is, while I love what I do, also such a strange space, also because like Scotland is also so very, especially the university I went to, not necessarily diverse, or at least not in terms of socioeconomic background and race and stuff like that. And so I've so often been like the darkest person in the room, which is ridiculous if you look at me, but that is sort of, I think I'd rather than look for things where I feel more like heard. You were saying earlier, with sort of, you were in a panel that like, and people didn't attack you. Yeah. You're like, what the hell? I'd sort of rather like hold out longer and try sort of until I've gotten there, I think. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of say something along those same lines, in that yes, as an industry, publishing and academia are extremely hostile. But within these sort of like industrial complexes, there are, of course, many people who don't like that and who are actively working to create structures that are different. Of course, sometimes it feels like very thankless work, or you feel like you've put so much effort into building something and then it gets destroyed, or you lose funding, or your project isn't accepted. But I think a huge part of it is finding people that you genuinely like and who genuinely like you and that you care about each other, and trying to pursue projects with them and trying to create your own, I don't want to say bubble because I don't think that's quite the right thing, but try to create your own smaller network within this larger hostile sort of organism. And this sort of like slapped me in the face recently, because, and I think this is what we were talking about, or one of the situations we were talking about. I was recently a presenter at a literary festival in Germany called Resonanzen. It's the first literary festival that sort of solely concentrates on Black German literature, or literature from the Black diaspora that is in some way in conversation with the German-speaking world. And something about the format of the festival really struck me, and it really seemed like something novel. And then when I thought about it, I really wondered why that was so novel to me. but there are a selection of authors who are chosen in advance. There is some form of competition in terms of selecting the authors, but once they are invited to the festival, there is no further competition. It's not that one of them at the end is deemed somehow the winner or receives a prize, but simply everyone who was accepted was allowed to present without this sort of like judgment or the need to, create a hierarchy of value, so that each author and their texts were extremely different, could just sort of like celebrate each other, in a way that I came away from this festival really thinking, there's something so novel in that approach that we can just sort of accept that everyone is doing something very different, and we can find value in that without trying to create a hierarchy. And I thought, this is like, yes, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to be a part of. And this is not something that has to only exist in this, sort of utopian space. But this is something that we can think about in all the practices that we do, that yes, there may be a finite number of positions for anything, but that if we are all working towards a common goal or with shared values, that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter as much who gets an individual position. Of course, it matters on a material level if we don't have money because we don't get a job or something like this. But if we're all able to participate in some way, that we try to help each other and not try to claw to the top of this sort of limited stack of resources. And I think that it's not as hard as we make it seem. In a lot of situations, there are genuinely people who want to help you, who are interested in what you do and are not trying to tear you down. But it's a matter of finding those people. And that can be very difficult. But when you find them, you need to value that, because that's what makes the work that we do worthwhile.
Yeah, it's actually, while you're saying this, I'm remembering I was part of a Black PhD sort of group that I think they had a Facebook and email thing, and the whole, everybody just shares all the jobs. Sort of even if you want it, you're like, look, this is out there. One of us should get it. And I think that sort of then takes precedence over I want it, so I'm going to keep it to myself, which doesn't work. But sort of that thought wasn't there.
Yeah.
I'm happy to take questions from the chat or from the audience here. If there are any, Leila, please. This one?
Do you want to?
Okay.
There's one question. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm guessing refusals are a universal part of both your careers as translators, regarding all the translations you pitch to publish only to never get an answer. Does this affect the titles you choose to pitch? Let me, for example, are there certain selection strategies you use to increase the chances of getting the translation published?
Okay, yeah, there are absolutely disappointments and rejections. But I think for me, if I've gone to the effort to translate a piece, it means that I'm invested in it to a great extent. And it would be very difficult for me to completely walk away from a project because one given publisher didn't like it. But what it does teach me, at least, is that there are different ways to pitch the same work to a different publisher. And this is something that I think I'm still learning, because different publishers want to publish things for different reasons. But maybe the reason why I think a work is worth translating and worth reading stays the same. And so I have to think about how to pitch or how to market a book in a different context to make its value legible to someone who maybe doesn't value it in the same way that I do. But it would not be something that would convince me that a project is not worthwhile. It would just it would force me to think about how else it could be understood and how else it could be a value to someone who maybe doesn't value the same things in it that I do.
Yeah, no, I cannot. That makes perfect sense. So it makes perfect sense in terms of you wouldn't suddenly think it's not good. If you're like, this is good, and someone says like, no, it's not, you're like, well, you're wrong. And so you maybe change tactics, but don't, it doesn't change your opinion.
Yeah.
I would suggest we take a second question from the chat and as our final question, and otherwise everyone would be, of course, invited here in the room to continue the conversation with Jon and Thalia afterwards. To what extent do you, as translators, believe your identities and experiences should shape and influence readers' understanding and interpretation of texts?
You want to take the first?
I was going to look at you. So you do have more translating experience.
I'm happy to say something.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think that this is a question that's, first of all, thank you. It's a really good question. Both of these are really good questions. I don't think that this is something that you can provide a single answer for. Like the reasons why I might be invested in a text and why I might want to translate a text can be really different. And it may be because I see myself in a character or in an author positionality, and it may be that I do want to write something of my own experience into the translation, or I think that a translation would allow me to do so, but that's not always the reason why I would want to translate a text. So I think there are ways in which sometimes my own positionality or my identity categories might influence a way that I translate something, or I think certainly it always influences it in some way. But to the extent that I am trying to write something into the translation, I think it really differs depending on what the text is. So I think it would be quite difficult to give one concrete answer to that question. I think there are different extents to which my own positionality influences the way that I translate a given work.
Yeah, I would second that, and I think so. Thinking of the sick woman theory, for example, when I first read that, and the reason I wanted to translate it is because I'm chronically ill myself, and sort of I recognized so much in that, and it gave me all these words I didn't know to like think and talk about illness. And then a lot of these words just don't exist in Dutch. So then sort of they're trying to tease out what do you call a flare in Dutch, or like if spoonies are a thing in English, then what would it be in Dutch? So that I think maybe that means that sort of at the end it has to do with care. That sort of it feels like I could bring a lot of care to this particular text for that reason. And I think similarly, the thing that sort of is often quite frustrating when you sort of hear about why translating texts, and then there's from the public there's a sort of, or from certain groups there's a sort of saying like, well, you shouldn't have done it like this, or maybe this word, just don't use this word. Or I think it was the Fanon translator in Dutch who sort of got a lot of commentary on his translation, and then wrote like a really angry response being like, I can do what I want, essentially. And like, that isn't care, that is about you. Yeah. And I feel like often if you're not that, like a white person, then you're sort of, the care comes into it automatically because it's in some ways about us or about people we know, and we sort of care about the text and sort of what the text does in the world in a different way. Like for example, with the love songs, there's like different versions of the N-word, and in Dutch that's there too. There's like the harsher version is very old in Dutch but exists, and I remember we all felt very strongly sort of like, well, at this point we could translate it directly, but then it feels like we're reintroducing this word. And so you do need to be aware of like, if I do that, then what does that do in the world that we're in, where racism is already a thing? Are we just going to hand them this? So I think, care is probably the way. So I feel like it does affect the level of care you bring to what you translate.
It's a great answer.
Thank you.
And I have to say also a great final statement. Let me say that when Leila and I were having a meeting about the event, we had a long list of questions. Actually, we could continue and go on and take the discussion also to the buzzword disruption and to activism. There were many more topics that we thought your work could inspire a lot, and I'm sure we can continue this talk for hours. I'm just afraid that time is limited, which is the reason why I would like to thank both of you for such a truly inspiring talk, and for all the input and the insights. Thank you very much for coming all the way from Michigan. Thank you very much for making this time available for this panel this evening.
Thank you so much for organizing and for your moderation.
I'd like to also thank my co-host for this evening, Leila Essa, without whom everything would have been also less inspiring for myself. So thank you very much, Leila, for agreeing to do this together with me. I'm very grateful for the Goethe Institute here in Amsterdam for the very kind invitation to host us here this evening. Thank you very much for having us. And it is also a co-funded event by the Dutch Research Council. There are invisible colleagues that you didn't get to see. They are at the other end also of the screen, who are together with Sibylle doing a great work, usually by hosting the events online and by giving us all sort of support. Marijke Wittler in Copenhagen and Christiane Lahusen in Stockholm make lots of space available for the curation to happen. So I would like to say a sincere thank you to everyone who is contributing to this event series one way or the other. Thank you very much to the audience for being here. And I would say we could continue all the conversation if you like. And to the online audience, we would say goodbye. Before I do so, I would like to remind everyone that the last event before the summer break is a reading next Tuesday with Hue Pham. Brothers and Ghosts is the name of the translation. The book got translated into English recently, and there was an event celebrating the translation and the release of the translation in London just a few weeks ago. So it's on Tuesday, 7 p.m. Berlin time. Again, online, we will be broadcasting from Khanat Jaloub. That's an Arabic bookstore at the heart of Berlin. So please join us if you like and have the time. It would be great to see everyone one way or the other. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. Goodbye.